So, I think we all remember 2019 and Martin Scorsese's infamous interview when he referred to the Marvel movies as a theme park, and the chaos, the glorious chaos that erupted from that. The situation became so out of control that the poor man had to follow up a single statement with a whole essay explanation article on New York Times. This did a lot of things, most notably informed a bunch of 16-year-olds on Twitter about the existence of people called filmmakers and that Martini Scorsese guy was one of them. But also it addressed an issue that a lot of people thought about but no one seemed to speak of. Do Marvel movies count as legitimate cinema, or are they really just guilty pleasure fun spectacles that you can turn off your brain to? But at the end of the day, most people just agreed to disagree. But now let's fast forward to 2021 when Ridley Scott and James Gunn, of all people, yes, that James Gunn, say almost the exact same thing, and suddenly the humanity is like, well, I mean... But how the hell did we go from slamming one of the best filmmakers of all time for sharing his objective opinion to this? Most of the people would say that the reason why nowadays people are more inclined to criticize MCU are the Avengers. They think that the momentum and level of epicness that the last two Avengers movies delivered in 2010s would forever cast a shadow on whatever new material MCU would come up with. But I personally believe that with the right build-up, decent enough writing, and some patience, I think MCU is more than capable and has every chance to pull off another, let's say, Thanos. The question is modern MCU actually showing any willingness to play by the rules of their own game? On the subject of games, before we get started, let's have a word from today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. So if you haven't heard about Raid, well, first of all, wow, and secondly, it's the most amazing RPG game that has swept the world by storm and now has the largest mobile gaming community. The game itself has over 600 completely unique champions, all of which come with their own background story. Use my links below to download Raid yourself to your mobile phone or PC. The newest released boss in Raid is insane. The thing is a Hydra with 6 individual heads, and each one is terrific in battle. One of the most interesting Hydra heads is the Head of Torment, which already sounds terrifying. It's insanely skilled at making you lose access to your skills, makes you skip turns, and drags your team using Trovere. And the only thing you're left to do is to hide by using champions with veils. Now next one is just like our boy Loki, the Head of Mischief. This one is truly chaotic since it can steal all the buffs from a champion and give them to Hydra heads. Even defeating this one is hard since it can redirect your attacks onto other Hydra heads. Raid right now is giving away an awesome super limited edition champion to every player, and you might recognize them as esports legend and Navi superstar Simple. The champion is only available until January 28th, so don't waste any time. Hurry and hit the link down in the description or scan my QR code to get Raid in order to get an epic champion Tyrell, 200k silver, 1 energy refill, 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard, so you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in game. And you will be able to claim your rewards by clicking right here. Thank you Raid for sponsoring today's video. Okay, again, before we get started, this video is going to solely center around and only apply exclusively to the most recent full-length MCU movies and not at all to any TV shows. This video will center around Marvel's success not in terms of the box office or popularity, but in terms of shifts in volume and quality. I personally consider myself to be a fan and have no intentions to drag MCU through the mud. Just point out some things I've observed over the past year or so. Now. The other day I rewatched Iron Man for the first time in a long time, and while watching the scene where Tony looks down the bomb that is about to blow his soul out of his body and realizes that it bears his own name, I kept thinking, where the hell did these subtle character moments go, and when did they leave in the first place? And that's when I registered just how much modern Marvel has neglected character-driven stories in its movies. The bigger the spectacle became, less and less movies concentrated on singular characters. It feels like today Marvel is not trusting its movies to be entertaining or intriguing enough to the audiences if it concentrates on a single hero, even if the movie is literally named after them. Even if we call it a solo movie, it really isn't. The newer films are more about the assembly of characters rather than a single person. This way, a screen time and writing resources that 10 years ago would be spent on fleshing out one single character is now being split into 4 or 5 or even 20. And naturally, writing suffers significantly. Now, am I saying that this is particularly a bad thing? As an idea, no. I mean, comic books are known for teaming up characters, but how well does it translate into a movie format? Well, Avengers proved that it's quite possible to translate it into a big screen. However, recently it seems like the studio either completely forgot or got too lazy to repeat the same notion. You see, Avengers worked not only because the most important team members had their own movies, but also because those movies actually worked to set up those characters for the bigger plot lines, instead of, mushing it all together. Ask yourself, would you be just as emotionally invested in Tony Stark's famous last words in Endgame if the same words in 2008's Iron Man were not set up to have that much of an impact? I mean, you can look at Chang-Chi and say that it's a good movie, which it is, but does it do much to set up Shang-Chi's character and his character arc just as well as MCU did with Iron Man or Captain America back then? You get to know about Shang's devastating childhood and his complicated relationship with his dad, but at this point, I think we can confidently assume that to create a compelling and complex character, it takes a lot more than a sappy background story and daddy issues. The same goes for Captain Marvel and Black Widow. Because the movies fail to decide how much time to spend on building up their protagonist outside of their backstory, you come out of the movie knowing about the person that is supposed to be the main character as much as you know about any quote-unquote side characters, if not less. Great characters are not made by flashback montages, but slow and subtle moments like when Steve jumps on the grenade, or Yinsen asks Tony to not waste his life. Today it feels like Marvel would rather spend those few important minutes on another overused and repetitive comical banter, or another CGI fight scene. And this works in favor of cinematic eyegasm, but works against the movie's credibility to be anything actually worth remembering outside of its visuals. At least not in the way you would remember the words, "I am Iron Man." Since lately, MCU has been clearly preferring to concentrate on visuals and entertainment value over screenplay, this in turn messes with audiences' perception on whether or not these movies deserve to be put on a high pedestal just because they're fun to watch. Some people probably are going to argue that the exception to this is the upcoming Spider-Man movie, No Way Home, and I would argue that this movie works more in favor of my argument rather than against it. Now let's take it into account that this movie is not just centering around a Peter Parker. It's a Spider-Man movie that, if you watched any of the trailers and are not living under a rock, is selling much more than just that. No Way Home is a perfect example of MCU preferring a quantity of characters rather than a single quality one. Back in 2017, Homecoming was a very refreshing chapter in MCU's history, since it felt more like an indie than anything else. Instead of concentrating on a bunch of characters or bigger action scenes, its entire screen time and resources were spent on introducing and fleshing out Tom Holland's new Parker, completely focusing on fleshing out his personality, innocence, and youth, which in turn completely paid off in making that scene from Infinity War an emotional train wreck. But while Homecoming felt more like a story from a friendly neighborhood, No Way Home seems to shape up to be straight out of Christopher Nolan's fever dream, which is not bad by any means. I don't know a single person who is not excited for this movie, but we can't deny the fact that it's nearly impossible to make such a grand-scale movie with so many characters and plot lines to wrap up without the main superhero and his character writing becoming somewhat of an afterthought. But I still held on to a hope that this movie will follow the footsteps of Spider-Verse rather than Spider-Man 3. We always like to say that a good CGI fight scene or a joke might age or may not age terribly, which is something that a good writing never does. A well-written script and a character could never not age like a fine wine, or become repetitive or boring. I remember reading somewhere that the Marvel has not become boring, it's just that we are getting bored of it. Probably the most common criticism you might hear of the MCU movie is that it feels too much like an MCU movie. It's too formulaic. But the thing about Marvel formula is that the Marvel formula is what makes a Marvel movie a Marvel movie. This formula is not just a secret ingredient the studio uses to make their movies spicier. It's a secret recipe that has literally become part of MCU's identity. If there's no formula, there is no Krabby Patty. Therefore, telling Marvel to stop making these types of movies is like telling McDonald's to stop selling their cheeseburger because you got bored of eating them all the time. But at the same time, you can't really blame people when the same color schemes, similar sounding scores, plots, action scenes, humor, pop culture references, antagonists, and characters are making them feel like they're being gaslit into paying to watch the same movie over and over again over the past years. It is not that formulaic movies are bad. It's just that they have an expiration date. And by expiring, I mean they will still probably be able to make money, but they will stop being taken seriously as movies unless they step up their game. But the thing about franchises is that if they stick to the setup blueprint for too long, they risk becoming recycled. And when they try to distance themselves from it, they risk losing their identity. And eventually, it always boils down to a lifelong battle between originality and familiarity, Marvel clearly preferring to stick to the latter. Now, another thing about these huge franchises that has an expiration date is the viewer's attention span. You see, even though I myself am quite acquainted with MCU's current lore, I always wondered when it would grow so much out of proportion that I physically wouldn't be able to keep up with all the canon thrown at me. It felt like it was only a matter of time when your casual movie watcher went from only having to watch a few predecessing movies in order to understand this new edition, to literally having to do a full-fledged research. To what most of the people might say that most of the viewers will still watch these movies since they don't care that much about understanding it as long as it remains entertaining enough. And that is exactly the problem. As Marvel's catalog grows naturally, less and less people will stick to watching them for the story or script or characters, and more for the funsies, since being invested in them would require them what would feel like a literal homework in order to enjoy a single piece of media. I'm not gonna lie, Marvel so far has done a decent job at avoiding this problem and making their standalone movies as isolated from the rest as possible, so that viewers could enjoy it as a separate film. But even if they do manage to separate their newer movies from the others, the studio itself won't be able to outrun their own lore and canon, which is painfully apparent with something like Eternals. The studio's desperate attempts to somehow shove Eternals into already tight-knit canon is just painful to watch. This went so out of hand that even the trailers for the film spent 90% of their time explaining Eternals' absence rather than promoting the movie itself. Anyway. So the thing I've observed over the years with the big and long-lasting franchises, remakes, reboots, TV shows, that once they run out of their creativity or ideas, they turn to good old representation. They either switch or introduce a character of different sexuality, gender, ethnicity in order to compensate for their lack of imagination. And again, it's not that I have anything against representation, but when the most important aspect of your lead character is their gender, ethnicity, upbringing, you know you're doing something wrong. I'm bringing this up because this type of thing, we've come to learn, in most cases is a clear sign of a franchise suffering from the lack of orientation. So if you clicked on this video in hopes of me telling you that Marvel is dying or superheroes aren't going anywhere anytime soon, you're going to be disappointed. Whether or not Marvel is going to stick around any longer is not a real question, because of course, as long as you're willing to pay for it. The real question is whether or not the money that we are giving to them is worth the quality of content we're getting out of it. To which the answer, if you took anything away from this video, might be that maybe that martini guy might have had a point.